They don't always look like villains. Sometimes manipulators wear warm smiles. They speak gently, act kindly, even show what seems like love. But behind it, something feels off, like your emotions are no longer yours, like your choices are slowly being shaped without your consent. That's the quiet power of manipulation. It doesn't always scream, it whispers. And sometimes it whispers through people who don't even know they're doing it. We tend to think manipulators are cold, calculating masterminds, scheming in the dark to control others. And in some cases, that's true. There are people who use others like tools, consciously, purposefully, and without remorse. But not every manipulator is aware. Not every manipulator is evil. Some of them are wounded, some of them are scared, some are simply acting out the parts of themselves they've never learned to face. Carl Jung saw it differently. He didn't just label behavior, he looked beneath it. He believed that we all carry within us a hidden force, the shadow. It's not a ghost. It's not evil. It's simply the part of us we hide. Our anger, our shame, our envy. The things we were told were unacceptable. So we locked them away. And we thought that made us good. But what we bury doesn't die. It just goes unconscious. It slips into our behavior, into our choices, into how we treat people. That's where manipulation often begins. Not with a plan, but with pain. With a need so strong and unmet, it finds any way it can to feel safe, seen, or in control. The person manipulating you might not even know why they do it. They might think they're protecting themselves. They might think they're loving you. But underneath, there's a shadow trying to be heard. Someone who feels invisible may seek control just to prove they matter. Someone who fears abandonment might twist the truth to keep others close. Someone who never felt safe might learn to manipulate just to survive. It's not always about malice. Sometimes it's about a wound so deep they can't even see it anymore. That doesn't make it okay. Pain doesn't give anyone the right to control or hurt you, but understanding it can help you stop taking it personally. It can help you see the wound instead of the weapon. And sometimes it helps you walk away without guilt, because you're not responsible for healing someone who refuses to face their own shadow. What we call manipulation is often a cry for power from someone who feels powerless. But until they're willing to look inside, to face what they've buried, it will keep showing up on the outside, in relationships, in conversations, in subtle ways that drain you. And that's the truth Jung wanted us to see, that the darkness we fear in others often begins as a denial of their own. The more we run from what's inside, the more it controls us from the shadows. Sometimes the ones who try to control everything around them are the ones who feel most powerless inside. It's not always about malice or cruelty, it's about survival. Deep beneath the surface of manipulation often lies a fragile core, shaped by early wounds no one ever saw. Maybe they grew up in a world where love had conditions, where silence was safer than honesty, where showing need meant opening yourself to pain. In such a world, they learned to adapt, to hide, to twist themselves into shapes that would keep them safe. And sometimes that meant using others without even realizing it. Guilt tripping, gaslighting, emotional games. These aren't just tactics, they're shields. They're habits born from fear and fed by years of disconnection. At some point, these behaviors worked. They brought results, or at least protection. And so, unknowingly, these strategies became part of their identity. Not because they wanted to hurt, but because they didn't know another way to feel safe or seen. But here's the tragic part. As they grow older, the same tools that once helped them survive now keep them stuck. Stuck in loops they can't see, driven by emotions they don't understand, reacting from wounds that never had a chance to heal. Carl Jung spoke to this truth with piercing clarity. He believed the only way out of such patterns isn't through guilt or self-hate, but through something much harder: truth. Real, raw, unforgiving truth. The kind that forces you to look in the mirror and admit what you've spent a lifetime denying, to face your own manipulation, to ask, why did I do that? What part of me was afraid? What am I still trying to protect? It takes courage to go there, to trace the roots of your behavior, not to shame, but to pain, to look at the darker parts of yourself and say, I see you, and I'm not turning away. That's what integration means. It's not about killing the shadow, it's about holding it in the light, learning its language, recognizing its whispers before they become screams. When someone begins to walk that path, something inside them shifts. They stop needing to control others because they've begun to make peace with their own chaos. They stop hurting people to feel powerful because they no longer feel powerless. And out of that, something honest is born, something that doesn't rely on masks or manipulation, a kind of strength that doesn't dominate, but connects, a kind of love that isn't conditional, a presence that feels safe because it is. The shadow never disappears. It's part of us. But when we stop pretending it's not there, when we stop letting it rule us from the dark, it becomes something else. A guide, a teacher, a source of creative fire. And the manipulator, whether that's someone else or the part of you that learned to play those roles, no longer has to live in hiding. They can begin to live in truth. Manipulation, then, is not just a problem to eliminate, it's a message, a symptom, a cry from the parts of us that were never seen, never held, never healed. Jung teaches us to listen, not to excuse the harm, but to understand its roots. Because only when we understand can we truly choose. Choose healing. Choose growth. Choose to stop acting from old wounds and begin responding from a place of inner freedom. That is the real transformation. And that's where everything begins to change. Sometimes the person trying to dominate a conversation, control a partner, or twist the truth isn't driven by malice, but by fear. A fear so deep and so unacknowledged that it takes the form of manipulation. They push, guilt, charm, or confuse others not because they are evil, but because their inner world is in disarray. Beneath that mask of control lies something fragile: old wounds, unmet needs, hidden insecurities. Instead of facing this pain, they project it. They see in others what they cannot bear to face in themselves. They make someone else feel small so they can feel just a little bigger. They create illusion after illusion, all in an attempt to escape their own chaos. And in the process, relationships suffer. One person feels lost in confusion, second-guessing their own reality. The other becomes increasingly reliant on control to keep the facade intact. It's a toxic dance, but not one that starts from malice. It starts from fragmentation. Carl Jung didn't see manipulators as villains written in stone. He saw them as human beings lost in the maze of their own unconscious mind. People who were once children, who maybe never felt safe to express themselves, who learned that vulnerability was a threat, that honesty led to pain, that power was the only way to avoid being hurt again. When you see manipulation through that lens, something softens. Not to excuse it, but to understand it, to see the deeper roots. Because the manipulator too is in pain. They are caught in their own shadow, acting out patterns they don't fully understand, trying to control others because they have never learned to control what's happening within themselves. And yet no one is born like this. Manipulation is learned. It's a symptom, not an identity, a red flag of unresolved pain. And that matters because if something is learned, it can be unlearned. This shift in perspective changes everything. It helps those who've been manipulated reclaim their sense of self. You begin to see clearly someone else's controlling behavior says more about their wounds than your worth. You stop internalizing it. You stop blaming yourself. You begin to set boundaries, not with guilt or confusion, but with clarity. You understand where the line is. You understand that protection doesn't mean shutting down your heart, it means honoring it. But there's something else here too. Hope for those who recognize manipulative tendencies in themselves. Jung's work isn't just about understanding others. It's about turning inward. It's about realizing that we all carry a shadow. We all have the capacity to hurt when we're unconscious. We all at some point avoid pain by placing it on someone else's shoulders. But once we become aware, we have a choice. We can face our inner world. We can explore the root of our fear, the origin of our coping patterns. And if we're brave enough to do that, the grip of manipulation begins to loosen. That journey is not easy. It requires raw honesty. It asks us to break through layers of denial, ego, and fear. But on the other side is something real. Authentic power. Not power over others, but power within. A grounded strength that doesn't need to manipulate, dominate, or deceive. A sense of self that is whole, clear, and rooted in emotional truth. So the real question isn't just who is the manipulator. The deeper question is, what are they avoiding? What are they afraid to feel? And can they, like any of us, choose to face the truth? Jung teaches us that the shadow is always there, but when we stop running from it, it stops ruling us. When we stop projecting it, we start integrating it. And in that integration, something beautiful happens. We grow. We become less reactive, more honest, more compassionate. We begin to live in alignment with our deeper self. This is the beginning of liberation. Emotional freedom doesn't come from controlling others. It comes from understanding ourselves. And once we do, we can finally stop surviving and start living. There's a moment in every life where we're forced to confront not just what's happening around us, but what's happening within us. And in that moment, manipulation stops being just something others do to us. It becomes a mirror, a reflection of our own unconscious patterns, our unhealed wounds, and the parts of ourselves we've long tried to ignore. What if every act of control, every subtle deception, every desperate reach for power was a cry from the depths of our psyche, pleading to be seen? Manipulation then isn't just a social issue, it's a spiritual summons, a call to wake up, to dig deeper, to ask, what inside me is reaching for control instead of healing? What shadow have I refused to meet? Carl Jung understood that beneath the surface of every manipulative act lies a sacred opportunity, an invitation to see the invisible forces that shape us. The shadow, yes, but also something even more ancient and powerful. Archetypes. These aren't just abstract ideas, they live within us. The ruler, the victim, the savior, the trickster. These timeless figures act out stories through our emotions, our relationships, and our choices, often without our permission or awareness. They are the characters behind the mask, guiding our hands from the unconscious. Think of the victim archetype. It doesn't just suffer, it learns how to survive by turning its pain into leverage. It draws others in with helplessness, but beneath that helplessness is often a deep-rooted fear of being truly seen or standing on one's own. Or the ruler archetype, always in control, always a step ahead, but behind the dominance is a child who once felt powerless and swore never to feel that way again. These archetypes shape the dance of manipulation like hidden puppeteers, influencing who we attract, how we react, and what patterns we repeat. And yet, once we begin to see them, really see them, they lose their grip. Because awareness is the first act of liberation. When we ask ourselves, which roles am I playing? Which ones do I default to when I'm scared or ashamed? Which parts of me are acting out the pain I never healed? That's when the unraveling begins. Slowly the mask falls, the shadow speaks, and the truth, though uncomfortable, starts to set us free. But it takes honesty, brutal, unflinching honesty. It takes the willingness to admit that sometimes we manipulate, sometimes we dominate, sometimes we pretend to be smaller than we are just to gain love or attention. And it takes courage to not judge those parts, but to understand them, to see them not as failures, but as survival strategies, ones that once protected us, but now keep us from growing. There's something deeply empowering in this work. When we start identifying the archetypes that drive our manipulation, whether we're using power or passivity, guilt or charm, we begin to step outside the game. We stop being unconscious players and start becoming conscious creators. We reclaim our choices. We reclaim our truth. Jung never promised this path would be easy, but he promised it would be real. He taught that no part of us, no matter how dark or deceptive, exists without meaning. Every shadow carries a lesson. Every archetype carries potential. And when we do the work to integrate these forces instead of letting them rule us, we transform. So if you've ever found yourself pulled into the same emotional patterns, caught in the same dynamics, asking the same questions, know that you're not alone. You're being nudged by something ancient within you, a pattern, a story, a wound, but also a choice to wake up, to grow, to become more than just a product of your pain. Because the truth is, The more you understand the stories running inside you, the less you need to manipulate the stories outside of you. And that's when real freedom begins. Sometimes manipulation wears a mask so gentle, you don't even realize what's happening until something inside you feels misplaced. Your boundaries, your sense of self, your peace. It doesn't always come as a demand or a lie. Sometimes it comes as a sigh, a silence, a tear strategically placed, a look that says, if you really cared, you'd stay. And before you know it, you're shrinking yourself. You're carrying emotions that don't belong to you. You're walking on eggshells in a space that once felt safe. That's the subtle nature of emotional manipulation. It doesn't need loud voices or overt threats. Sometimes it whispers. It leans on guilt. It cloaks itself in fragility so convincing that you feel like the villain for saying no. The manipulator doesn't always know they're manipulating. They may genuinely feel broken, genuinely believe they're loving, protecting, even sacrificing. But that's what makes it so powerful. Because it comes not just from intention, but from unconscious patterns, from a hidden part of the psyche that Carl Jung called the shadow. The shadow isn't just where we hide rage or jealousy. It's where we bury the parts of ourselves we were taught to reject. Sensitivity, neediness, fear, desire. Maybe someone once said, don't cry, or you're too much, or be strong. And so we did. We buried those parts. Not because they were wrong, but because we were afraid. And what's buried doesn't disappear. It waits. It seeps out in behaviors we can't always explain. In control masked as care. In guilt masked as love. In dependence masked as devotion. When someone hasn't integrated their shadow, when they haven't looked into those dark, dusty corners of the self, they act it out. Not as villains, but as people who don't know any other way. They become the savior who gives too much, but expects loyalty in return. Or the martyr who suffers visibly, hoping their pain will buy them love or obedience. These roles, these archetypes, aren't random. They're survival stories passed down, learned through pain, cemented by repetition. They aren't worn consciously, they wear us. And this doesn't just affect the one doing the manipulating. It pulls the other person's shadow into the spotlight too. If you carry a fear of abandonment, someone else's silence can control you. If guilt has long been your prison, a single disappointed glance can chain you. It becomes a dance of wounds, an invisible exchange between two unconscious minds. You think you're making your own choices. You think you're being kind, generous, loyal. But something beneath the surface is guiding your every step. Something ancient, something unresolved. That's the terrifying beauty of manipulation. It bypasses logic. It taps directly into the emotional body, the symbolic mind. It doesn't argue, it resonates. It speaks in a language older than words. A manipulator doesn't need to ask for power. They pull it from your forgotten scars. And unless you've done the work to see those scars, you'll keep responding. Not because you're weak, but because you're human. But here's where the shift begins. When you understand manipulation, not as a conscious strategy, but as a collision of archetypes and unintegrated shadows, you stop taking it personally. You stop feeling ashamed for being caught in it. You begin to see it as a signal, a message that something in you still longs to be healed. You begin to ask, why did I feel responsible for their emotions? Why did I believe I owed them my silence? What part of me believed my value was measured by how much I endured? These are hard questions, but they're the beginning of freedom. Because the more you understand your own inner workings, the archetypes that move you, the shadows that shape you, the less power manipulation holds over you. You stop dancing to unconscious rhythms. You start making conscious choices. You stop trying to fix people who are pulling you into their unresolved pain. You begin to set boundaries, not out of defense, but out of clarity. You begin to walk away, not in anger, but in truth. And if you've been the one who manipulates, even without meaning to, there is no shame in that recognition. There is only the next step, to go inward, to ask where it started, to meet the parts of yourself you once had to hide, to stop demanding from others what you have not yet given yourself. Because that is what it means to integrate the shadow. It's not about perfection, it's about honesty, it's about becoming whole. Manipulation is a wound that wears many faces, but beneath every one of them is a longing to be seen, to be safe, to be loved. And only when we stop trying to get those needs met through control or guilt do we finally open to something more honest, more sacred, a love that is not taken, but shared, a power that is not over others, but within ourselves. That is the path Jung pointed to, and that is the path back to wholeness. There's a hidden battlefield inside all of us, an emotional landscape shaped not just by our experiences, but by unseen forces operating beneath the surface. It's where the shadow and the archetype collide, weaving a web of illusions, power plays, and unconscious roles. And in this space, manipulation thrives, not always with malice, but with confusion. People play parts they don't even know they're playing. They seek safety through control, validation through sacrifice, love through guilt. And those who interact with them get caught in the script, unsure of where their own feelings end and someone else's begin. But something powerful happens when you start to see the pattern, when you realize that what looked like betrayal may actually be projection, that what felt like dominance might be fear in disguise. Suddenly, the emotional fog begins to clear. You see that manipulation is rarely about evil. It's about disconnection from the self, from the truth, from wounds too painful to face. And that awareness, however uncomfortable, is the beginning of real freedom. Because once you can name it, you can step outside of it. It begins with noticing the roles. That moment when someone shows up not as themselves, but as a character, a savior trying too hard to rescue, a martyr drowning in their own sacrifice, a ruler masking anxiety with control. These are not authentic expressions of love or presence. They are performances driven by the unconscious. And just as important is the courage to notice when we are the ones wearing the mask, when we use silence to punish, when we give with strings attached, when we mold ourselves into what we think will make others stay. These aren't signs of weakness. They're signs of unhealed parts trying to be heard. Carl Jung taught that the only true way out of this cycle is through the shadow, not by fighting it, not by denying it, but by inviting it in. Shadow integration isn't about becoming perfect. It's about becoming whole. It means standing face to face with your own contradictions, your envy, your fear of being insignificant, your craving to be seen. It's about understanding that those parts aren't flaws. They're exiled pieces of your humanity, waiting to be welcomed back. And when you do, something shifts. The energy you once used to manipulate becomes the energy you use to create. The triggers that once owned you become doorways into deeper insight. You stop reacting blindly and start choosing deliberately. You stop needing to play a role to earn love. You become someone who can connect without control, give without resentment, love without pretending. This is what healing looks like. Not perfection, but presence. Not performance, but truth. And with each layer of awareness, you begin to rewrite the narrative. You become less of a product of your pain and more of a participant in your own transformation. You don't just spot manipulation in others. You stop accepting it as your emotional currency. You don't just see the wounds. You respond to them with boundaries and clarity, not guilt or shame. It's not an easy path. There's no quick fix, no instant release. It's a slow unraveling, a brave dismantling of everything false. But it's also the path that leads to the kind of power that doesn't need to be taken from others. It's the kind that rises from within, the kind that no one can manipulate because it's rooted in self-knowledge. Manipulation doesn't appear out of nowhere. It has roots, it has stories, it has pain. But those roots can be seen, those stories can be rewritten, that pain can be healed. And when you begin that process, not just for others, but for yourself, you stop being a player in someone else's emotional game. You start becoming the author of your own life. That is what it means to live from your center, not your shadow. To relate from wholeness, not fear. To love without losing yourself. That is the quiet revolution that begins the moment you choose awareness over repetition. And once you begin, you never truly go back. There's a reason manipulation often feels so confusing, so heavy. It's not just about words or actions. It's about energy. An energy that stems from places buried deep in the psyche, places most people don't even know they carry. Beneath every attempt to control, persuade, or guilt lies something far more vulnerable. Pain, not the kind that screams, but the kind that sits quietly in the dark, shaping a person's behavior without their awareness. Carl Jung called this hidden space the shadow, the part of ourselves we learn to push away, to hide, to silence. It holds our fears, our shame, our unfulfilled needs, and our old emotional wounds. And when these wounds are left untouched, they don't vanish. They grow. They learn how to speak through manipulation. Picture a child who needed love but was met with coldness, who needed reassurance but was told to toughen up, who learned that their needs were too much, that their feelings were inconvenient. That child doesn't disappear. They grow into an adult who still longs for connection, but fears it just as much. So they reach for control, not because they're cruel, but because control feels safer than vulnerability. They don't want to manipulate. They want to survive. That's the paradox. Manipulation is not born from strength. It's born from fear. Fear of being abandoned, fear of being invisible, fear of being hurt again. And in trying to avoid those fears, people unconsciously create exactly what they're running from. They push others away. They break trust. They build relationships on illusion rather than truth. And in the end, they confirm the very belief that shaped their fear to begin with, that love isn't safe, that people always leave, that they'll never be enough. And yet none of this is obvious on the surface. Manipulation can look like charm, like sacrifice, like care. It can come dressed as protectiveness or concern. It can sound like, I just want what's best for you. It can feel like affection until it doesn't, until you start questioning yourself, second-guessing your instincts, compromising your own needs to keep someone else stable. That's how subtle and powerful these patterns can be, because they come not just from one person's shadow, but from the silent agreement between two people's wounds. But awareness changes everything. When we learn to see manipulation not just as an attack, but as a defense, something softens. We stop personalizing it. We stop feeling like we're broken for being drawn into it. And we start understanding it for what it is, an emotional survival strategy gone unchecked. That doesn't mean we excuse it. The harm it causes is real, but understanding gives us options. It gives us language. It gives us the power to respond with clarity instead of confusion. It also calls us inward, because manipulation isn't just something that happens to us. It's something any of us can fall into when we're afraid and unaware. It can show up in small ways: a sigh meant to guilt, a compliment laced with expectation, a silence used to punish. These are the quiet moments where the shadow reaches out and tries to get its needs met the only way it knows how. But when we become conscious, when we catch ourselves in those moments, we create space. Space to ask, what am I really afraid of? What do I really need? Can I express that honestly instead of trying to control the outcome? That's where healing begins. Not with perfection, but with presence. Not by erasing the shadow, but by facing it. When we start meeting those rejected parts of ourselves with compassion, when we allow ourselves to feel what we've long avoided, grief, shame, longing, we begin to take back our power, real power, the kind that doesn't need to manipulate because it's rooted in truth, the kind that creates connection, not confusion. In the end, manipulation isn't the story, it's a symptom, a sign that something inside is still hurting, still hiding, still hoping to be seen. And when we recognize that, not just in others, but in ourselves, we begin the real work, the work of integration, of healing, of showing up without the mask. And that is what transforms our relationships, our choices, and our lives. Sometimes the most profound healing doesn't come from cutting people off. It comes from turning inward and seeing clearly. It comes from recognizing that the manipulative behaviors we've endured, or perhaps even acted out ourselves, are rooted in something deeper than the surface drama. They're cries from the unconscious, signals of unhealed wounds, echoes from childhood moments when love was earned, not given, when safety meant silence, when being too much or not enough taught us how to hide. And that's where the real work begins. Not in just labeling people as toxic or walking away in anger, but in gently uncovering the hidden stories that gave birth to those patterns. Because manipulation isn't just a tactic, it's a language. It's how fear speaks when it doesn't feel safe. It's how pain reaches out when it hasn't learned how to ask for help. It's what happens when someone's shadow takes the wheel. Carl Jung understood that the shadow is not evil. It's exiled. It holds the parts of ourselves we couldn't bear to face. Our envy, our rage, our need, our shame. And when we suppress these parts, they don't just disappear. They become loud in quieter ways. In sarcasm that cuts, in guilt trips that bind, in silence that punishes, in smiles that lie. And the person manipulating, whether they realize it or not, is often someone still lost in their own internal war, projecting the chaos they've never been able to sit with. This is where awareness changes everything. When we see the shadow behind the mask, the wound behind the behavior, we can choose something different. Not tolerance, not passivity, but wisdom. Instead of reacting with confusion or rage, we begin to respond with clarity. We stop personalizing what was never ours to carry. We stop mistaking someone else's fear for a measure of our value. We see manipulation not as a reflection of who we are, but of what they haven't yet healed. But this awareness also calls us to our own shadows, because manipulation isn't something that exists only outside of us. It lives within us too, often quietly, in the moments we hide how we feel to get a certain response, in the ways we twist our needs into sacrifice to earn love, in the little lies we tell to avoid being seen too clearly. It's uncomfortable to admit, but it's also the doorway to freedom, because the moment we begin to own it, we take our power back from it. This is what integration looks like. Not becoming perfect, but becoming honest. Honest with what we feel. Honest with how we cope. Honest with the fact that sometimes we too manipulate, not out of malice, but out of fear. And that's okay. What matters is what we do next. Do we keep acting from the wound? Or do we begin the slow, courageous work of healing it? Boundaries are part of that healing. They're not punishments, they're self-respect. They say, I see your pain, but I won't carry it for you. They say, I understand where this comes from, but I will not shrink to make you feel safe. We can hold compassion and still say no. We can recognize someone's trauma and still protect our peace. Empathy doesn't mean staying silent. It means seeing clearly and choosing wisely. So when manipulation enters your life, whether from others or from within, it's not just a red flag. It's a mirror. It's an invitation to pause and look deeper, to ask, what am I truly feeling? What am I truly afraid of? And what do I need to face that with honesty instead of control? That's how cycles break. Not with blame, but with awareness. Not with shame, but with courage. Because once we see the roots, once we trace the pain back to its origin, we can finally stop watering it. We can choose to respond differently. We can choose to live without the armor. And that's the quiet power of this path. You don't just free yourself from manipulation. You become someone who no longer needs it. Someone who can speak with truth, act with integrity, and love without playing roles. That's what it means to reclaim your life from the shadows. To be guided not by fear, but by clarity, compassion, and choice. Compassion is a beautiful strength. But when it costs us our peace, when it keeps us tethered to patterns that diminish us, it becomes a weight instead of a light. There's a difference between understanding someone's pain and allowing that pain to dictate how we're treated. And this boundary, this delicate balance between empathy and self-respect, is where our true power lies. But what about the manipulator? Can someone who's built their life around control, projection, and subtle emotional tactics truly change? The answer is yes, but only if they choose to. Healing for them isn't easy. It asks for a kind of bravery that most people avoid their whole lives. It demands that they stop running from themselves, that they look directly at the raw, uncomfortable truth of who they've become, that they feel what they've buried: rage, shame, helplessness, fear of being unloved. This isn't about guilt, it's about ownership. It's about dropping the blame, the stories, the masks, and sitting in the silence of their own pain. That's where transformation begins. Because when the manipulator finally stops projecting their darkness outward and turns inward with honesty, something incredible happens. The energy that was once used to control others becomes available for growth, for real, grounded change. That same intensity can be directed toward building trust, cultivating self-awareness, learning how to love without conditions. And this realization isn't just for those who manipulate, it's for all of us. Whether we've been on the receiving end, whether we've played the role ourselves, or whether we simply want to grow into more conscious, compassionate people, it's a call to hold both compassion and accountability, to see the pain behind the manipulation without letting it hijack our reality, to offer understanding without surrendering our own dignity. Because emotional well-being is not something anyone can give us, it's something we build through choices, through boundaries, through the quiet, powerful act of choosing not to abandon ourselves in order to keep someone else comfortable. And that starts when we learn to recognize manipulation, not just by its impact, but by its patterns. One of the clearest and most consistent red flags is a mismatch between words and actions. The manipulator is often a master of illusion. They will tell you what you want to hear, paint beautiful pictures with their promises, only to act in ways that contradict everything they said. In private, they're one person. In public, they're another. Their loyalty changes with the audience. Their stories shift depending on what they want from you. This isn't a quirk, it's a strategy. It's control masked as charm. And once you start noticing this inconsistency, it becomes impossible to unsee. Another powerful tool in the manipulator's arsenal is guilt. Not the kind that comes from a mistake you've made, but the kind that is planted and watered by someone else. You begin to feel responsible for their mood, their problems, their choices. You start apologizing for things that aren't yours to own. And slowly, your world begins to revolve around managing their emotions, walking on eggshells, trying to prevent the next guilt trip from landing. This isn't love. It's emotional entrapment. It's a dynamic that feeds off your empathy and slowly erodes your boundaries. And it's one of the most important signals to pay attention to. Because the moment someone makes you feel responsible for their inner state without taking accountability for their own behavior, they're not looking for connection. They're looking for control. When you see these signs, broken promises, shifting stories, weaponized guilt, you don't need to explain them away. You don't need to question your instincts. What you need is clarity. Clarity that your emotional safety matters, that you're not here to be twisted into someone else's coping mechanism, that you have a right to peace, even if it means walking away from someone still trapped in their shadow. Because no amount of compassion can fix someone who's not willing to do the work. Healing is available to anyone, but only if they reach for it. And until then, your only responsibility is to yourself, to honor your truth, to trust what you feel, to know that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's just the quiet decision to no longer participate in a game that costs you your joy. That's not cruelty. That's wisdom. You may hear things like, if you really cared about me, you wouldn't do this. Or, after everything I've done for you, this is how you treat me? And just like that, the ground beneath you shifts. You feel your empathy being twisted, your kindness being weaponized. Suddenly, you're apologizing for things you didn't do. You're second-guessing yourself. You're caught in a storm of emotions that don't even belong to you. This tactic is subtle, but powerful. It plays on our most human instinct, the desire to be good, to be caring, to not hurt the ones we love. And the manipulator knows this. They don't ask for what they want directly. Instead, they wrap their demands in guilt, in implication, in emotional blackmail. It's not a conversation, it's a performance. One designed to make you feel like the villain in a story you didn't write. And when guilt stops working, silence becomes the next weapon. Not the kind that comes from self-reflection, but the kind that's cold, calculated. They withdraw, they stop responding, they emotionally vanish. You're left grasping at the air, wondering what you did wrong, why they've shut down, and how to make it right. But that silence isn't emptiness, it's control. It's a loud message that says, give me what I want, or I will disappear from you. And for many, that fear, the fear of abandonment, is all it takes to bend, to give in, to silence their own needs just to keep someone from walking away. Because deep inside so many of us is that wound, the one that says love is conditional, that safety is earned, that if we don't perform, we'll be left behind. Then there's the erosion of your emotional truth, the slow, almost invisible gaslighting that makes you question your own experience. You try to express hurt, but you're told you're being dramatic. You bring up a boundary, and it's met with eye rolls or laughter. The message is always the same. You're the problem, not me. And over time, that message becomes internalized. You start to believe it. You shrink your voice. You doubt your feelings. You abandon yourself. And that's exactly the point. Because when someone can make you question your emotional reality, they've already begun to control your decisions. The more you doubt yourself, the more you rely on them to define the truth. And that's the goal. Not connection, not resolution, but dependence. Another red flag that often flies under the radar is the constant need for attention, drama, and validation. The manipulator often wears the mask of the victim, even when they're the one causing harm. They spin small issues into chaos, make every inconvenience a crisis, and center themselves in every story. Why? Because attention is their currency. As long as everyone's focused on them, no one's looking too closely at their behavior. No one's holding them accountable. It's not just about being seen, it's about distraction. And it works. You spend so much time soothing their pain, solving their problems, or managing their moods that your own needs fall completely off the radar. Carl Jung taught that within each of us, the roles of manipulator and manipulated both live. The shadow is not someone else's problem. It's a part of our own psyche. We carry the victim and the villain, the abandoned child and the over-controlling adult. These parts aren't evil. They're exiled, rejected, hidden. And the more we pretend they're not there, the more they act out in unconscious, destructive ways. The key is integration, not perfection, not purity, but honesty. Looking into the corners of ourselves we've tried to hide. The part that's afraid of not being loved. The part that wants power. The part that lashes out when it feels small. The part that manipulates, not out of cruelty, but out of fear. And when we meet those parts with truth, not judgment, we begin to change. We become less reactive, less likely to fall into someone else's control, less likely to try and control others. We learn how to say no without guilt, how to speak up without fear, how to stay grounded in our truth, even when someone tries to twist it. This is where the real freedom begins, when we stop playing roles and start owning our whole selves. When we no longer need to manipulate or be manipulated to feel safe, wanted, or worthy. When love becomes something shared, not something performed. That's the power of shadow work. That's the strength that comes from finally seeing clearly. The need to control doesn't always come from a place of cruelty. Sometimes it rises from a deeper wound, a belief etched so early in life that the only way to be loved, to be safe, to matter, is to manage everything around us. That kind of belief doesn't shout. It whispers from the background of our behaviors, guiding choices we don't even know we're making. The child who was never heard becomes the adult who speaks too loudly. The person who once felt invisible learns to manipulate not to hurt, but to avoid being forgotten again. But make no mistake, this journey inward, this turning of the gaze toward the self, is not gentle work. It takes courage, real, soul-deep courage. The kind that requires us to look at ourselves not through the lens of who we wish we were, but who we really are. It asks us to lower the armor, to drop the performance, to stop seeking justification, and instead begin seeking truth. It's radical honesty, and it will strip you bare before it sets you free. To face our shadow is not to punish ourselves. It's to finally meet the parts we've locked away, the parts we've hidden out of shame or fear, and to say, you belong here too. Healing doesn't come from denial. It comes from integration, from choosing to no longer exile our wounds, but to learn from them. That is where transformation begins. Not in fighting the shadow, but in listening to it. Not in silencing the inner chaos, but in understanding what it's been trying to say. And the reward for this difficult, often painful work? It's not applause. It's not perfection. It's peace. A kind of peace that no one else can give you, and no one can take away. The power you reclaim isn't the power to control others. It's the power to stand in your own truth, to walk through life without constantly grasping for validation, approval, or control. You become whole again, quietly, steadily whole, and in that wholeness, something beautiful happens. Your relationships change. They no longer revolve around fear, games, or emotional bargains. They become spaces of honesty, of mutual respect, of vulnerability that doesn't feel like weakness, but like freedom. When you begin to see manipulation for what it truly is, not just as a weapon, but as a symptom, you stop blaming blindly. You stop reacting with confusion or rage. You learn to protect yourself with clarity, not hostility. And that clarity is what sets you free. Free to choose differently. Free to love without losing yourself. Free to forgive, not to excuse, but to unburden. Free to live in a way that reflects not your wounds, but your healing. This path doesn't require you to be flawless. You will fall into old patterns. You will forget. You will remember. You will keep going. That's growth. That's what it means to live with consciousness. So I invite you to ask the questions that matter. What parts of your shadow are still running the show? Where are your unhealed wounds making decisions for you? Have you ever used guilt, control, or silence, not to hurt, but to feel safe? And now that you know, what can you do differently? Maybe it's a boundary you've been too afraid to draw. Maybe it's journaling what you never dared to say aloud. Maybe it's a moment of stillness where you sit with yourself and say, I see you, all of you, and you're still worthy. Whatever step you take, no matter how small, it matters. Every act of self-awareness is a light turned on in the dark. Every gesture of care toward yourself sends a ripple outward. Because healing is never isolated. When you begin to heal, the people around you begin to feel it. Your clarity becomes their mirror. Your peace becomes their permission. So don't wait for someone else to change first. Be the one who looks inward. Be the one who chooses truth. Be the one who walks with compassion. For others, yes, but most of all, for yourself. That's where it all begins. And from there, the path unfolds, one conscious step at a time.